Hello, welcome to Scott's Odyssey. In other videos we touched on the 7 Years' War that took place between 1756 through 1763. It was a global war between Great Britain and France to see who the world superpower would really end up being. So for the colonies, this war really didn't see much in the lines of action between colonists and the French. Well, not directly. You see, for the colonists, they had to deal with the back end of the 7 Years' War, known locally as the French and Indian War, which ultimately became a protracted war that lasted much longer than 7 years. And this site will tell part of the story. See you in a minute. Welcome back. If you've watched my videos before, thank you for your patronage, and if you're new to Scott's Odyssey, welcome aboard. Okay, let's keep history straight. The 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War are technically the same war. You see, here in the colonies, the French were employing the natives of the Ohio Valley, which at this time stretched all the way to the Allegheny Mountains, and they were doing it to weed out and kill off the colonists. This is partly why the Six Nations are historically called Iroquois, which is a French bastardization of the Huron word for black snakes, and is really rather derogatory in terms of the people that they were describing as opposed to their official name of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, representing the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Mohawk, the Tuscarora, and the native locals in this area, the Oneidas or Juniatas, all members of the people of the Long House. Now, why did I state that this was a protracted war of the French and Indian side? Well, a protracted war is a war that lasts longer than expected, and history tells us that the war ended in 1763. But this site tells a story quite different than that, and this is why, although they were technically the same war, the 7 Years' War for this part of Pennsylvania is called the French and Indian War. Or one might argue that the French and Indian War ended in 1763, and the continuing conflicts became known as the First Indian Depredations, where depredations means a time when Indians partook in conflicts to the point of massacres and excessive cruelty upon the invaders of their land. And, well, at the beginning of 1763, there was a proclamation that said no colonist could go into nor beyond the Allegheny Mountains. That is until October 7th, when King George III released the Royal Proclamation of 1763 that followed the Treaty of Paris of 1763, which transferred all the North American territory formerly held by the French to Great Britain. Now, it's important to note that this proclamation did include an exclusionary zone specific for an Indian reserve. This territory was delineated as west of the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, from the bottom of Lake Michigan to the top of Alabama, and was called Trans-Appalachia. The downside is that the British assumed the Albany Plan of Union purchase back in 1754 was still in good standing, which included the territory south of modern-day Center County and as far west as Ebensburg, or the western side of Altoona. Now, by this time, we are already long past the walking purchase fiasco of 1737 that ended with the Lenni Lenape petitioning the king, who said they could have their land to use. But it was also found that the Penn family were the sovereigns to the territory and the sole proprietors. But that was only up to Mouse Chunk, currently called Jim Thorpe, so it doesn't even matter for this area. No, we are talking about the Ohio Valley Indian Territory. The first depredations took place immediately after the 7 Years' War and continued for quite some time. During the first Indian depredations, we had forts to protect the local constituents, like Fort Bedford, Fort Crowhan, Fort Dickey, Fort Ferguson, LaTorte, Macomb, Morris, Lowther, Halifax, Chambers, Davis. The list goes on for almost 100 forts to protect the colonists who chose to settle the wilder parts of Pennsylvania. As a matter of fact, At that time, the closest fort to this location would have been Fort Standing Stone, about 20 miles away, where Huntington now stands, which is mentioned in the very first video of Odyssey regarding the tale of a tale, the McGuire Massacre Cemetery. This specific area was nothing more than barely farmland, owned and operated by the Lowry family, who had only recently begun to clear-cut the land. Why were they in this land? Well, the Lowry's brothers, Daniel, James, and Colonel Alexander, were all registered and licensed Indian traders. Not a small title back in those days, which is probably what led to some of the animosity and ego for those who later moved into the area, especially being that Colonel Alexander seems to not have gotten along with his brothers Daniel and James and held the larger majority of the tracts of lands that were here. And the whole thing about being an Indian trader, that's how you were paid, land. But during the events that we are interested in will be the time period of Lazarus Lowry, the son of Colonel Alex Lowry. Lazarus, whom was the builder of Fort Lowry. The beginning of the end of the first Indian depredations came about in 1768 with the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, a negotiation of territory between the Native American nations and Great Britain for a line of property following the Ohio River to Kentucky, all of the Virginia colony territory, most of West Virginia, and special provisions regarding land claimed by settlers in Pennsylvania, which were defined by the previous Penn family territory in the new purchase. This brought the end of the first Indian depredations. Well, sort of. You see, all because the land was now transferred to the colonists did not mean that the natives of the Ohio Valley liked it, or that their tribe was even part of the Six Nations, and that brought about a whole new can of worms. The second Indian depredations had begun, which was technically just a continuation of the first depredations, just these Indians didn't get the memo. Now, you may be asking, how important were these smaller blockhouse forts that were built? Well, they were important enough that from 1768 onward, more blockhouse forts were being built, even though there was a treaty, because the depredations in these parts of Pennsylvania were raging onward with no lull and no end in sight. The only quiet in the depredations would have been seen during the Revolutionary War, when Indians of the Six Nation Confederacy fell into disagreement with each other and were independently choosing different sides of the conflict, whether they be British or now what were called the Revolutionaries. And many of the former colonists just plain hated the Indians outright and were mad that the Crown did not properly negotiate the territory in Pennsylvania going westward. They actually hated the fact that the Indians were given any of the land west of the Alleghenies. What? You don't believe me? Well, then you explain why it's specifically stated within the Declaration of Independence that, in response to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, we charge King George III with, and I quote, endeavored to prevent the population of these states and endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. It says that in there. So yeah, they were not exactly seeking peace with the natives by any means, but they were not out to get them either. That brings us to this site, and one of the stories of this site. The building you see is the former site of Fort Lowry, another blockhouse fort built to protect against Native Americans. Now, you hear the term blockhouse often when fort names come up, and that's because there were blockhouse forts, which means privately owned local forts, usually constructed by a wealthy local individual or two, and used for the safety of all locals. And then you have wood forts, which were the ones built by the early royal colonists and later on by the not-so-royal revolutionaries. The difference between the two is that one was a block bunkhouse that you would run and hide in and shoot out through small gun loops, and the other was a full-blown, very large self-sustaining facility meant for long-term encampment and defense with bastions, casements, embrasures, galleries, parapets, ramparts, redoubts, and, well, I could make an entire video on all the parts of a wood fort, and there's a lot of them. On the Lowry farm, just a short distance from Water Street and the infamous Battle Swamp, now known as Alexandria, was built a blockhouse fort in 1778 and named Fort Lowry. Now, why was this fort built when Fort Anderson in Petersburg, just a mere 7 miles away and significantly larger, had recently been finished and ready to help everyone in this entire area? Well, you see, there was a major personality conflict and business disagreements taking place between many of the landowners in these parts of Pennsylvania. And when I say personality conflict, I do mean ego. So much that many of the local constituents of the Canoe Valley would not fort at Lowry and instead would travel all the way over to Fort Anderson. And although the specific reasons are not recorded, the information that is available states the settlers' disagreements as actual animosity toward each other, which brings us to the next part of the story. In 1760, a family of pioneers set out to make their stake on land somewhere in the western portion of Pennsylvania. Their names were Matthew Dean and Jacob Roller, whom both left Chester County and followed the Forbes Road to the Katanning Trail, to the headwaters of the Frankstown branch of the Juniata River, and finally decided to settle in the Canoe Valley, well within the territory of the Native American reservation. Matthew soon took a wife named Rebecca and raised a family, and as time wore on, more settlers came to this beloved valley, and they too founded a paradise. As an early settler, Matthew soon found himself to be the go-to person who was revered for his knowledge of the area and his upstanding merit toward everyone within the community. His name became prominently known far and wide, which garnered him a seat as an associate judge for Bedford County in 1778. A half a mile from his home, the Lowry Fort was just finished construction at the heels of increased fear of Indian attacks on the locals such as the McGuires and the Donnellys. In 1780, reports that the Indians were forming raid parties and other Indians seen wearing their war paint began to circulate in the community. On October 1st, Captain William Simonton of the Bedford County Militia, the commander of Fort Lowry, and Matthew Dean's friend and neighbor, came to visit with the family to discuss the need for Matthew to take his family to forting until the Indian raid parties in the Sinking Valley disbanded. Now, Matthew, who was known to hold his own against Indian raids, openly spoke of his disdain for the owner of the fort and the importance of the safety of his farm and family, and that he could manage on his own, so declined the warning and did not fort. What would transpire next was an event so horrible that the historical record conflicts on many points. But the end result is the same, and only the surviving will of Matthew Dean tells us the result. What we know for a fact is that Matthew's household consisted of his mother, his wife Rebecca, who was within a day or two of giving birth to another child, his oldest son John, his daughters Rebecca, Elizabeth, Margaret, and an 8-year-old daughter whose name is not recorded, his youngest son Samuel, and his infant daughter whose name is also not recorded. In both instances, historically, it was common practice to not record the names of young children in the family who were murdered or died from horrific incident, with exception of a birth mention in the local or family Bible, in which it was also common to scratch out their names if they died very young. Something that didn't change until about the 1950s. Captain Simonton, who needed to speak with the others in the community, left his son behind to play with the Dean's youngest boy, Samuel, on behest of Mrs. Dean, and stated he would be back for his son the following morning. In the early morning, October 2nd, 1780, Matthew, his eldest son John, his daughters Rebecca, Elizabeth, and Margaret were out working in the cornfield when one of them noticed smoke rising from the direction of the homestead. They all ran toward the home in order to put out this fire, seemingly unsuspecting to what was going on around them. As they reached the burning home, they found blood around the property, and Matthew's 8-year-old daughter scalped on the front steps. It was about the same time that Captain Simonton arrived at the property. Matthew Dean's mother, his pregnant wife Rebecca, his youngest son Samuel, and his infant daughter were all dead inside the inferno left behind by the Indians. Missing was the son of Captain Simonton. As would have been typical for the time period and the actions of the native tribes, young John Simonton was most likely taken captive to be indoctrinated into the tribe. Although many would consider this a horrific tactic of savagery, it was a very normal practice to, if you will, adopt the children of the enemy tribes in order to raise them safely, especially being that you're the one responsible for their orphancy, and the war was not between you and the child, it was between you and the adult. Besides, it was an intelligent manner in which to conduct exogamy and keep the bloodlines from getting too close together. When word reached the fort, the community was devastated. The Bettys immediately formed a posse consisting of 7 brothers. The Kreiders, another family of 7 brothers, immediately joined the posse. Oddly enough, 7 of the Ricketts family and 7 of the Moores also joined the posse. Historically, this group of these families represented the most fearsome group of frontiersmen ever seen in Pennsylvania. The posse left the fort seeking to retrieve the captain's son and wreak revenge on the massacre of the Dean family. The search went on for days, but nobody was ever found. The charred remains of Dean's family were removed from the rubble of the home and interred in the soil outside of what was Fort Lowry. Today, only the foundation of Fort Lowry remains, and built upon it is what was the German Reformed Church, which at some time was changed to the Keller Church. Matthew and his remaining family left the Canoe Valley and moved next to Little's Fort, a blockhouse fort on the other side of Williamsburg Mountain in the Hartslog Valley, just 2 miles away from Alexandria. Unfortunately, Matthew Dean died in April of 1781, less than 6 months later from a broken heart, and was buried in Hartslog Cemetery, just a short walking distance from Alexandria. It was not until the Treaty of Fort McIntosh in 1785, a Revolutionary War fort located on the Ohio River and Beaver River confluence in modern-day Beaver, Pennsylvania, that the newly independent Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, as it stands today, came into existence and pushed the reservation territory out to the Cuyahoga and Muskingum rivers in Ohio, thus forever ending the Indian depredations. If you like learning the story of the Dean family massacre and would like to see a similar story, check out this video here. As always, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.